Kazakhstan to a family of Ahiska Turks whose grandparents were forcibly deported during the Soviet era. So he has a very strong personal connection to both this event and historical and demographic studies. He has held key leadership roles at Nazarbayev intellectual schools, overseeing strategic development and quality assurance. His expertise includes educational assessment, psychometrics, and strategic planning. His interests span history, demography, and international relations. And I'll also introduce Claire Kaiser. Claire Kaiser is an adjunct professor at the Georgetown University's Center for Eurasian, Russian, and Eastern European Studies, and the head of strategy for McLarty Associates, a Washington-based global strategy firm. She's the author of Georgian and Soviet, Entitled Nationhood, and the Specter of Stalin in the Caucasus. She's also contributed to edited volumes on Georgian nationalism and empire in the Soviet periphery. Dr. Kaiser has been an instructor at the Department of State's Foreign Service Institute, served as an election observer for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and missions to Azerbaijan, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan, and began her career at the U.S. Embassy in Kiev. She earned a PhD in modern Russian and Soviet history at the University of Pennsylvania, an MA in Eurasian, Russian, and Eastern European Studies, and a BA in Foreign Service from Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, and is a term member of the Council of Foreign Relations, and she speaks Russian as well as Georgian.
Wow, lots of accomplishments. Thank you. And thank you, Josh, for giving background. So this panel talks about Georgia and about our community repatriation and deportation itself. So our distinguished guests each of them will answer a few questions, and they will have time to start with their own remarks if they wish. I know that many of us already speak except Rustam and Claire. So I'd like to start with you. Dr. Claire, please, you have 5 minutes to 10 minutes to basically talk about your point of view, and then there's a few questions.
Great, thank you, and thanks so much for the invitation today and your attention on a Friday afternoon. So I thought, kind of building upon the biographical introduction that was just provided, I could describe a little bit kind of why I'm here and how I came to the topic of the Meskhetian deportation, since it might not be immediately obvious. So as was mentioned, I published a book about a year and a half ago called Georgian and Soviet, entitled Nationhood and the Specter of Stalin in the Caucasus. And so this really is a study, archivally based principally from archives based in Georgia, about how Georgians and other groups in Georgia leveraged Soviet institutions of nation building toward their own ends over the course of the Soviet period, but principally focusing from the 1940s onward. And so I was interested to see, on the one hand, the extent to which those efforts, succeeded, and what the impact was on other, groups and constituencies within the Republic. So one of the early chapters in my book deals with not just population politics, but deportations and expulsion operations that occurred on the territory of the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic. And I think certainly in the scholarship, but I think also in the broader consciousness outside of your community, people tend to think of Soviet deportations, maybe of the Crimean Tatars, maybe of North Caucasians, but I think operations that took place in the Southern Caucasus don't tend to be kind of on the map, and I think that is first of all an egregious sort of gap in people's understanding of what happened, but I also think it obscures our understanding of what precisely was going on, kind of in this mysterious late World War II, early Cold War period, which was quite uncertain and saw some very bold, creative, and brutal efforts by various Soviet actors to try to redraw the map, in some cases displace or erase populations, and in other cases, play a larger geopolitical game on the sort of actual territory of the Caucasus. So that is how I kind of got academically to the Meskhetian operation. I really view the November 1944, though I think the planning for it started much earlier. I think the first documents I found were from March of that year. Operation expelling the Meskhetians, as well as groups from Ajara, and I think associated groups of, Azerbaijani, according to their passport, all occurring in the same few weeks, really to be the opening salvo in a new logic for these deportation operations. And this was a new perspective of intent coming from Soviet officials, and that meant that I think the case for repatriation, the case for property claims, and a lot of those associated challenges, thus were different than what perhaps we saw in the North Caucasus with the Crimean Tatars and elsewhere. And so, a lot of times I think the Meskhetian deportation is kind of lumped in, there were all these that happened in 1943, and then also the Meskhetians, and these were the wholesale deportations. But of course, the intent of the operation, the lack of accusations levied against the Meskhetians, that's very, very different from what we see with the Crimean Tatars, with the Chechens, the Balkars, the Ingush, etc. So rather than being punitive, and of course, punitive not in practice, but for perceived collaboration with the Nazis, which of course is something that most have found to be rather questionable. In the case of the Meskhetians, I think Beria himself was quite clear in describing plans for the operation that this was a border cleansing operation. This was due to perceived threat of connections to Turkey, and that was fairly transparent, at least in looking at the planning documents. So this is different from punishing wholesale groups for alleged collaboration with German or Romanian occupiers. I mean, that is a fundamental definitional difference. And so for that reason, I describe the Meskhetian operation occurring in late 1944 not as a kind of wartime operation, but really the first of the post-war expulsion campaigns. And that is how I situate it in my research. Again, drawing from Georgian archival documents as well as some coming from central sources in Russia, but using that as a sort of breaking point or pivot point, I suppose, because the Soviet Union did continue expulsion operations, not wholesale, but still in large quantity in the South Caucasus, in addition to what they were doing in Eastern Europe for the rest of kind of the late Stalin era. So, I cover in my book a similar operation that took place in mid-1949 against Turks, Greeks, and Dashnaks, as well as Iranians. And so that's another one that's not really written into the sort of consciousness of the broader sort of historical narrative, but was profoundly important for Georgia and the South Caucasus, as these groups were expelled to Central Asia and Siberia. Unlike the Meskhetians, though, of course, those groups were allowed to come back. So, there's many dynamics that I talk about in the book that I think are important to consider when looking at the Meskhetian case, because it was so unusual in many ways and was, as I argue, kind of a pivot in how the Soviet state understood these operations. This was a time, of course, when the local dynamics were crucial, but it is a top-down, extremely hierarchical system where you have Stalin and Beria, of course, calling the shots in Moscow, but maintaining extremely, penetrative networks of patronage in their homeland in Georgia. And so you see the sort of space of decision-making between the Caucasus and the Kremlin, quite blurred in this period. And that definitely comes through in looking at how operations like this were carried out on the local level. Though I think, again, and this is something that sort of surprised me when I was looking in archival documents in Georgia about the Meskhetian operation, it's interesting to see how it evolved in planning, kind of between local officials, kind of in the regions, in Tbilisi and in Moscow, starting from March, where it was much more limited in scope, and the intent was really to resettle groups within Georgia, just out of the border zones, to then by the end of the year, covering a broader swath of territory, including Ajara, adding a few other groups into the mix. And then it, fully being out of the bounds of the republic. So you see an escalation that is coming both from, central authorities, but also being implemented at a local level. So the numbers that were assigned for deportation, end up in practice being much bigger than what was initially ordered, which I think, shows how things were implemented in practice, and then makes it that much more challenging, of course, later on when you're making the case for right to return. So that's how I situate this case in my book and kind of what I was able to glean from the archival sources that I used to sort of back this up in my book. Of course, it's a much longer story, but I think this early Cold War environment of perceived danger from Turkey, there's a lot of other sort of gambits at the time coming from Moscow, coming from Georgia, coming from Armenia as well, territorial claims, even claims of territorial transfer within the South Caucasus that gets very contentious at this time. Of course, at the end of the day, the map doesn't get redrawn, but I think understanding that broader context of what policymakers were trying to do in the context of redrawing the map, population transfer, redefining what this sort of principal nationality in the Republic, who was and was not in that community, all starts to get much more clearly delineated with of course, crucial consequences going forward. Thereafter, I think we see, and this perhaps leads us a bit more into the present day, surprising continuity in Georgian perspectives on the repatriation issue. I mean, looking at the leader of Georgia.
We're going to touch to that specifically. I'm going to ask questions, but go ahead, continue.
Just looking in the 50s and 60s when Georgia was run by a man called Vasil Mujavnadze. He's using a lot of the same justification for why repatriation doesn't make sense as we saw from Shevardnadze, and really, I think as we've seen subsequently. So despite the change in, structure of the Soviet Union, Georgian independence, the realities of what this region actually looks like and who's inhabiting it, I think the sort of official Georgian perspective on the issue, you see more continuity and how they're viewing things than certainly on a lot of other issues. So that's worth maybe untangling a little bit further, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kaiser. It's unbelievable. Thank you for diving us into the details of you call it Meskhetian operation, but I remember, I'm trying to quote, it says Turks, Hamshins, and Kurds.
Yes.
So the terms of Meskhetian is now popular. It wasn't even a question back then. For the reasoning of deporting us, nobody says we're Meskhetians. They deliberately deport us because we've been Turks. This is I'm not a historian, don't quote me on this. This is, just we can continue to talk about that. But that quote is basically says a lot. And until late 80s, 90s, nobody was talking about Meskhetians. It was then in late 80s when the term of Meskhetians started popping up. So this is a quick remark, but I'm gonna let the speaker Rustam. He has a small slide to share, I guess. So go ahead, Rustam. You can talk, yes. Can you guys make sure that his mic is working?
So thank you very much. So, honored guests, esteemed colleagues, I'm referring to the academicians here and members of Ahiska Turkish community. So, we're here to remember the 80th anniversary of this tragic event. I call it tragic deportation. Over 100,000 innocent members of our community, and including my grandparents. So, thinking about this topic, I tried to find the core value which should be the main to resolve this situation, what we are discussing in today's session. And I think that historical justice could be really help to identify the key components that is connected and essential to achieve our goals. Historical justice is not about acknowledging the wrongs, it's about taking action to make the things right. So first, recognition of the deportation as an act of ethnic cleansing So to add what the Claire said, in November 1944, Soviet army was fighting in the border of Germany in a Hungarian operation. And it's already 6 months past as the Soviet allies, like US and others, was performing the Normandian operation. So there was no threat to the Soviet border. So that's why I think that it's understandable that it was deliberate attempt to erase our community from its homeland. Recognizing this fact is a foundation, that's why I put it as a foundation of the home shape figure. It's the foundation. And building on this, we need the legal acknowledgement. Legal acknowledgement, for example, Georgia must formally recognize this act as a political, was just political repression. And acknowledgement is that this is the critical step to start rehabilitation. Because everybody now speaks about repatriation, but repatriation can be built only based on rehabilitation. When you, so you see that if the historical justice is a core, then this acknowledgement is starting a kind of beginning to the process of healing. Probably all of us, all of you, familiar with this alternative report provided to the UN Commission for elimination of racial discrimination, where the things which happening in Georgia, there was a legal barriers, there was a lot of bureaucracy against those who wants to relocate to Georgia, and this really against to the obligations which was taken by Georgian government back in 1999 while joining the European Commission. So following this, we have to state that Ahiska Turks lost their homes, lands, and livelihoods due to the deportation. Restoring these properties or offering fair compensation is vital for reconnecting our community to their history and roots. Compensation is not about placing a value on our pain, but it's essential to step to acknowledging the harm. Fourth, we need to ensure repatriation. The right to return must be supported without any barriers and must be supported by government, and they should help to build the future for those who want to relocate there, preserving their language, religion, and cultural values. I want to share the story. 10 years ago, I was traveling in the train, and the guy, when he understood that I'm Ahiska Turk, he told me a story of 75-year-old Ahiska man who was traveling from South Kazakhstan to the west. It's about 25 hours for you to now travel. And this old man was praying at every stop where the train stops, and every station. Of course, the other passengers was puzzled and asking why he is doing so. And he told the story. During the deportation, he was a 5-year-old boy, and his mother passed away in this train. And her body just was thrown from the garbage, thrown out from the garbage. And this old Ahiska man was praying because he didn't know where his mother is rest. And the praying, he was hoping to find a place and to reach and to help to her mothers get rest. So this is one of the 26,000 stories which should be told, not only by Ahiska Turks. I think these stories should be told also by academic communities, by research communities as well. Because as one young man today asked how we can go internationally. So I am from Kazakhstan, so it's already international. And also the stories which could be told academically by the research community, by international human rights organizations could have a lot of impact. And I hope that international organizations can step in and we can build the better future for all displaced people in the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Very powerful. It's a very unique way to present the vision and strategy and the solution. I appreciate that. Georgia, we talk a lot about Georgia and what's happened. You also mentioned there wasn't any need, and our community wasn't any threat to the regime in Georgia, but being just ethnically different. And not just the religious wise, because so many thousands of Muslims, Georgian Muslims or Ajaris or Azerbaijani community in the other side of the Georgia remain there. But those who deliberately call them Turks, only Turks, as such we are, we've been deported. And it's very critical to understand what in legal ways could be done to tackle this issue of identity that Georgian authorities trying to impose to us, because they're claiming that there is and this is a dividing point, by the way. There is a number of people in our community that dividing just because of this ethnicity point, So I'd like to get your perspective as a lawyer, what could be done, just give your perspective on that, and then there's a few more questions will come up, follow up.
Absolutely. So if I understood correctly, what can be done in terms of the returning back and Georgia recognizing the Ahiska Turks. Any effort that will be done has to be international. And if we are to do anything, it would probably start with our government here in the United States, right? One of the largest communities are in Dayton, Ohio, and as I earlier said, introduction of some bills, even recognizing the genocide that happened, can be one of the first steps where the Ahiska Turkish community is recognized. And it's very interesting, politics are involved a lot. So we are talking about Georgia and Ahiska Turks community, but I also can't stop thinking about what's happening in Georgia today. They just had elections, and it seems that Russia is taking over Georgia. And if it does, then is that going to prevent any efforts for Ahiska Turks to even try to go back to Georgia? Because clearly we all know that Russia never treated Ahiska Turks kindly, never recognized them as people, right? Never issued any identity documents, and was trying to erase the whole ethnic group. So if Georgia falls into completely under Russian control, then is that the place where people even want to return tomorrow?
Good rhetorical question. We're going to touch base and continue to explore that. But now, Steve, a few words, please.
Well, maybe I'll come in on that point, but I also want to recognize a friend in the audience who we've been talking about the historic effort to bring the Meskhetian Turks to the United States as refugees. And my friend, Kathy Kosman, formerly of the Helsinki Commission and Human Rights Watch. I wanted to mention in this group that when she was with Human Rights Watch, went to the Fergana Valley after the pogroms in 1989 and documented the killings.
Can you stand up, please?
The ethnic violence in the Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic. So I mean, you've got people in this room who have been long following and doing the work of documenting what's happened to this community. So I think it's so great to have her here. But just to come in on the Georgia point, from a legal perspective, as we know, Georgia signed accession documents in 1999. When it acceded to the Council of Europe, it took upon itself the obligation to facilitate the repatriation of the Meskhetian population. That was the wording. There was, at that time, a greater level of interest from the EU. There was funding flowing to scholarship and repatriation efforts in Georgia. I went at that time in the early 2000s, and I had an opportunity to advise the government in Georgia a bit on this issue. And, you know, Nazli, to your point about Russia preventing Georgia from allowing the repatriation, I'd say that the Georgians have done that pretty well themselves without Russian help. I mean, Mikhail Saakashvili, right, the most pro-Western you could find, he went to Haltzeche in the early 2000s. He said, we'll never allow them back. And he played upon the fears of ethnic conflict with Armenians, which is this familiar trope, which we know. But at the time, in the intervening years, groups of scholars advised the government of Georgia on the adoption of a repatriation law. And as you might know, the law that was adopted in 2007, yes, it was maybe a small step towards justice, but it had major flaws and problems. One of which, and this was confirmed for me last year when I went to Haltzeche and I met with some of the NGOs on the ground, one problem of the law, or the actual implementation of the law, is that when people have resettled to Georgia, they must withdraw from any other citizenship before potentially getting Georgian citizenship, which leaves them incredibly vulnerable. So what I was told by groups on the ground at Ahiska last year is that the few, not even 1,000, but hundreds that maybe have tried to repatriate since 2007 have by now pretty much all left and gone back, mostly to Azerbaijan. That's one. Two is the long-standing bias, you could say, or the approach within, maybe unspoken policy within the Georgian government, which has said that if you want to be accepted here, more or less you have to adopt the Georgian orientation, meaning there was an informal pressure placed on individuals to change their surnames to Georgian surnames. And the two communities that exist today, the two villages that I visited, are ones that have largely adopted the Georgian perspective on the ethnic origins of the Meskhetians. That's in Guria and in Imereti, a village called Ianeti in Guria, and also Samtredia in Imereti. So it's very interesting. And also in Tbilisi, you have some activists, like the Baratashvili family. So these groups are there. There are probably less than 2,000 Meskhetians, but there's a major uphill battle. But I do agree with you that more recognition of the deportation as a crime against humanity would only lend support towards the effort of achieving more historical justice and a right to reparations and a right to repatriation. So.
Thank you. Yeah. Claire, and continuing this topic, you know well Georgia, you studied well, you already mentioned. What is the perspective of Georgian authorities, government, on this matter? Because they're doing everything to prevent it happening. So being as someone who did study and speaking Georgian, you have a better insight. What's their perspective of this issue?
Well, today, yeah. So I think, as I said in my opening remarks, I think somewhat surprisingly, this is a thread of surprising continuity, you know, going back several decades. Doesn't matter, you know, if it's Soviet leaders, if it's Shevardnadze, you know, independence Shevardnadze, Saakashvili, and Georgian Dream. I mean, these are quite different types of leaders with different ambitions, but I think all have determined that at least politically, they don't get a whole lot out of resolving this issue, you know, in a favorable light. I mean, I think certainly there was the Council of Europe process that Steve and others referenced, but you know that obviously has not advanced in any meaningful way. So we think, you know, the hill is steep for several different reasons. You know, the political gain for Georgians has not really been demonstrated to date. And needless to say, given their current political crisis, though, I mean, they've been in political crisis for years now. And so I think to kind of the average Georgian, there are so many issues that are kind of front and center in their daily lives, and this election that just happened in late October, felt quite decisive for most people, I think. This doesn't sort of fit into that narrative for most Georgian voters and politicians, I think. Secondly, I think the issues in a post-Soviet context related to Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and Georgian IDPs also has been something that Georgian officials can say, hey, we have our own problems, we need to resettle our own IDPs, we need to give them state support, et cetera. We can't deal with the repatriation of Meskhetians too. We have this other problem to deal with. And so that's been kind of another, I guess, excuse maybe isn't the right word, but another argument that they have offered, kind of certainly in the early 90s, but then doubled down on post-2008, I think, for why, now is not the time to sort of make good on the Council of Europe 1999 process. I also think, we're up against, in Georgia, a bigger picture sort of historical challenge. And Georgia at the moment, and this is not unique to Georgia, but it's something that I've been particularly close to in Georgia, the knowledge of the Soviet period, Soviet history, and what actually happened in Georgia is enormously fraught, and one that has kind of had national level significance in politics. And so, I know there's a number of sort of civic activists, academics, and that sort of thing who have mobilized over the past decade or so to try to, expose the truths of what happened in Georgia in the Soviet period in terms of repressions, in terms of deportations, in terms of family histories, that sort of thing. But that is just getting started. They're in the very earliest stages of that. And, the Stalin question remains quite contentious locally as well, and changes forms depending on who's controlling the conversation. So those are all very kind of live and contentious politics in Georgia now, too. And so I think I'm hopeful that, first of all, that process of sort of historical memory and doing proper scholarly work, doing public history right, can tell the sort of full story of Soviet history in Georgia, first and foremost. But as part of that, it's not kind of a one-sided history, like that the story of the deportation of Turks, Kurds, and Himshils, the Meskhetian operations, is part of that story, and it has to be. I mean, it's a big part of what was happening in Georgia in that period, and so there is a public discussion to be had on this sort of longer, I guess, 70-year map of exploration there. But there's a lot of work to be done still in that regard, and one that needs, I think, Tbilisi buy-in in order to make it happen, and we aren't seeing that right now.
Continue on this. Rustam, so Ahiska Turks scholar, very successful, by the way. You are right now working on your doctorate, but what you think Ahiska Turkish community, how it's affected, by the way, being scattered in different countries, deported, and what's the expectation now of the community?
So I think that we have to divide the challenges in two categories. First is those who are suffering with the citizenship and legal issues, like getting the basic things like education, healthcare, access to the everyday's normal life situation. And second is that those who living in, for example, in this situation we can refer to Russia and Georgia probably. And we have the Ahiska Turkish people living in Kazakhstan and more or less stable. They have the basic, they don't have the issue with legal, the citizenship issue, but there is a challenge as well. So for example, we don't have the access to the formal education in our language, so we have to run Sunday schools, we call it. And also we have to, as a community, to preserve our language, tradition, culture, we have to be self-sustained and organized. So we run the community centers, close what we have in Dayton, for example, but it's more about cultural thing rather than we are not able to speak there about politics, about the to demand something, but we can still work on the cultural issues. And of course, we do believe, for example, in Kazakhstan, that education, the good education, is a key for those who suffer. And that's why we organize a lot of festivals related to our heritage, to our history, and we invite educated people just to say that there is a success story of Ahiska community members. So that's why I can divide it in two problems. So,
The consequences of deportation and being spread around the countries is not just to be in a stateless in some place, if I'm summarizing you, but also the challenges of preserving identity in some other places where there's less pressure, but still.
Yeah, and they're building up, I call it as a third identity. So I'm a third generation who lives in Kazakhstan, so in relative peace, but to building my identity, I need to speak Turkish, and I don't have the formal education in Turkish. So that's why we feel ourselves like an in-between person. So we are not like fully Ahiska Turkish who has their access to education, to the historical, cultural things. Of course, we try to preserve all the traditions using our weddings, events, etc. But yeah, there is another things happening, for example, in Ukraine or in Azerbaijan as well. So we have common challenges, but we also have the context-specific challenges, and that's have to be mitigated. And I think the good education and unification, connections with the rest of the community who lives because of this deportation now in 9 different states. So countries, yeah. So this is the way to preserve our heritage and culture. Thank you.
Thank you. But Nazlı Hanım, you have health as you're part of the Crimean Tatar. What's the similarities between Crimean Tatar and our community? Because both communities been deported, and we already know that the reasoning is different, but we lived in the same region. Most of us lived in Uzbekistan with Crimean Tatars. Any similarities you want to mention or touch base?
Absolutely, and also half is Azerbaijani, right?
Yeah,
So
half
Azerbaijan
Azerbaijani,
is there too. I am basically like the map of where the Ahiska went.
Yes.
It's interesting. Dr. Kaiser mentioned earlier that Ahiska, the Meskhetian operation was very different from, like, for example, Crimean Tatar deportation and others. But for me, it seems the same because it was about fear of Soviet Union government's cooperation of one ethnic group with another government. And that fear that the government had basically prompted, like, oh, this is what we've done before. We've deported ethnic groups. Let's do it again. The Crimean Tatars were deported in 1942 and also struggled. Actually, over 200,000 people died in the trains by the time they reached the Central Asia. And the population shrank greatly, just like there's about 20,000 Ahiska Turks who died in the trains. And then later, they also weren't allowed to get jobs, to be educated, and it all came with a struggle. I remember my grandfather saying that when he graduated from high school, he did not receive a gold medal. At that time, Soviet Union was giving gold medals, Zolotaya medal, for the great achievements in education. He didn't get it just because he was Crimean Tatar. And then later, when he became a medical doctor, he was also preempted from a lot of things. So equality wasn't there. And I feel like, and same thing with like exercising religion, right? During communist times, no one could exercise a religion and people were hiding and still doing things. But that was like one of the other big troubles that are same for Ahiska Turks and Crimean Tatar population, both Muslim communities, being able to relate to their religion. Another interesting similarity I find, which is very interesting, both communities used Arabic before to write and to communicate, and that was also a way of self-preservation, because a lot of communication was done with Arabic letters, but in Turkish language. And it was a way to not let Soviets and Russians to read what was communicated between each other, which is like very smart way to do things, right, on their part. Finally, I would say the big difference between communities is that Crimean Tatars were allowed to return back in '86 and to Crimea, right? And then were never really apologized to, but somewhat type of apology came out from Putin in early 2000s. It wasn't like, sorry, we deported and killed a bunch of you and committed genocide, but it was somewhat an apology where I feel like Ahiska Turks were never apologized to, and the whole genocide and the deportation is not even recognized on the larger scale. So the community, that's, I would say, like the main differences in the community, where the struggles in Uzbekistan, in Azerbaijan, and other places was very similar to inability to use the language, get jobs, education, preserve the culture.
I see. Very, very important points raised. And you start preparing questions, and I'm going to ask a few more, then I will pass to you guys to ask any questions. But Steve, there is a connection between Ahiska Turks being in US today and being deported. Very good friend of us and a very good organization called HIAS, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. There is a connection of them and the whole this deportation, and Steve works, how we came. So give us a little bit perspective. How this, how that lobbying effort was, how actually we became in the radar of State Department, and why it's connected to the deportation.
Well, no, there's a lot of interesting footnotes or side streets to this story, and I mentioned Kathy here. The Helsinki Commission, Amnesty International was at the time that I was in Krasnodar. I was witnessing how Memorial Human Rights Center in Moscow, they were coming down with field missions to Krasnodar Krai, and they were documenting, and an expert, some of you might remember, Alexander Osipov, he wrote really important reports that told the story of persecution. He would then share that with Maureen Greenwood at Amnesty International here in DC, who would then take that to her contacts, such as Mark Hetfield at the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and everyone was speaking about this situation. It took some time. I remember an activist that some of you might remember him, Vadim Karstylov, an activist in Novorossiysk. He came to Washington and he lobbied and he talked to the State Department, and these discussions were happening, and the germ was born, the idea was born to create the P2 category, to open up a refugee resettlement program. And interestingly, we talked about this a bit with Rich and I on and Maria on the Wilson Center video we did last week. But this was an example of Russian cooperation with the United States. It was very sensitive to be resettling residents of the Russian Federation to the United States. And so the classification that the State Department used when they described the program was that the Ahiska Turks were nationals of Uzbekistan, not residents of Russia. And when the program was first conceived, it was only for those that had Soviet passports, only those that had not integrated or remained stateless. But as time went on, it became clear that families were mixed. You had a husband with a Soviet passport, the wife with the Russian passport. So obviously you wouldn't separate the family. So that became, that morphed into Krasnodar being the center of gravity. But that excluded everyone in Rostov. It excluded everyone in Stavropol. It excluded everyone in Kalmykia. And you had, again, a problematic situation. It also excluded the Khemshins, who lived in Apsheronsk and Belarechinsk region of Krasnodar. It also excluded the Batumi Kurds, who are still there. And so I think about all those aspects. This just goes to show how important it is, the activism that we're talking about here today. One other point that you mentioned about Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, when the program started, I remember making visits to Philadelphia and Lancaster and meeting with the refugee agencies that were working with the community. And a lot of these communities, Jewish Family Children Services was one of the, an International Rescue Committee, and they would tell me how amazing their experience was with the Meskhetian Turks. Rabatiagi, hardworking people, incredibly impressive. And again, it showed how the Jewish American community, as you said, the Soviet emigre that came before, and also the Baku Armenians, all of these set in motion the precedent for this program. And so there's a lot of commonality, a lot of shared space between these different communities. Did I answer your question? I think I did.
Yes, and I have a follow-up.
Oh,
About
sure.
10 years ago,
Yes.
or 12 years ago, we came to DC by invitation of Georgia non-for-profit organization. I forget the exact name, but they came because they have the grant by a Georgian authority and European Union to do research of resettlement in United States of Ahiska Turks. So they went to Atlanta and some other places. It was probably 15 years ago, more than 10 years ago. And they've been surprised by the things they've been hearing. That time I had a hope that why the successful resettlement to US not going to adopt it by the Georgian to resettle some of the nearby in Caucasus or Azerbaijan. There was a lots of people who wanted to move there. So they never did, and I don't know what's the fate of after they did the research. They interviewed all of us, and then I don't know what's happened after point. But my question to you, how we can convince as a community and as a maybe involving U.S. Government too, and I understand there is a challenge in terms of Russification or Russification of the Georgia right now, right? The influence of Russia there. But still, is there a path to convince or kind of, and this is a question to all of you, to convince them that we are not a threat as they preserve, and unlike other communities that had some maybe violence or other mean of fighting for their freedom or rights, one of the very unique and maybe only group that never actually did anything is Ahiska Turks. So we are non-violent, very hardworking, and we can transform the places we live, as we show in Fergana, as we show in Russia. Places we live wasn't really popular places before we came, and now we show that same thing in US. So.
Well, in terms of forming a dialogue with the Georgian authorities, well, I mean, I'll say that when I've been in Georgia and I've met with Georgian NGOs, as Claire mentioned, there has been a process in the last 10, 12 or more years of revisiting the 1930s. There's been important cases lodged with the European Court of Human Rights to receive compensation for the legacy of abuses during the Stalin period. So there's been a movement towards beginning to acknowledge the Soviet-era crimes, which involves and includes the European Court of Human Rights. And that's important, of course. But I also have been interested in the idea that some of you here would be able to form a partnership with scholars in Georgia, with NGOs in Georgia, to, again, tell the story, write the history, have exchanges. Now, I know that there's a group of activists in Georgia this week from your community, but I think we need a systematic effort. And I should say, again, I did see some interest in Tbilisi years ago, an interest in, of course, they would refer to the community differently. They wouldn't necessarily say Ahiska Turk. They would say Meskheti, right? But still, there's an interest in revisiting that history. So I do think that, I hope that some in the community here will learn Georgian, not just Turkish, and pursue scholarship and activism about this right of reparations and repatriation, as I said before. So.
And
Dr. Kaiser?
I'd just add a couple things to that. I mean, yes to everything Steve just said, but whatever sort of scholarship about the operation, the experience of deportation, there's devastation that it has had on your community and efforts to try to, overcome that, that will be produced. It needs to be translated into Georgian. If you want any circle kind of beyond the Anglophone Tbilisi elite to read it, it needs to be into Georgian. No, I was in Tbilisi about 6 weeks ago for the Georgian language translation launch of my book, and I'm delighted that it's in Georgian because it's one thing for, a small circle of people in Tbilisi to perhaps engage with it, but I know that it will have a much wider readership if it's actually in Georgian. So if we are going to raise the awareness of your community, of the history, and of the plight, among stakeholders in Georgia, you need to do it in Georgian in addition to, other languages. So I would encourage that, and there is, funding and interest in that certainly by groups in Georgia, and grants and that sort of thing. On the kind of diplomatic question, I guess, U.S. policy on this issue remains a big question mark.
No policy, obviously.
Yeah, no policy.
There's no policy.
I don't think that in the near term there's likely to be any sort of strong signal in that regard. But I do think, the Russia sort of factor has been raised, but I think perhaps the more important one for your issues is the very strong relationship that Georgia now has with both Turkey and with Azerbaijan. I mean, that is the key sort of regional trifecta. Those links are growing, middle corridor, strong diplomatic ties between the three governments. And so, perhaps that is an avenue, regardless of what happens in the US, regardless of what happens kind of with Georgia's EU aspirations or not. I mean, I think the tie between Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Turkey, probably has a bit more durability, and given, your community and issues, that's likely worth pursuing.
Can I add
Rustam, go ahead.
Yeah.
And then
I think there is the one thing is missing for the future building is the trust between Georgian and our community, and that trust is missed because the communication between our community and Georgians was through the Russian. And I urge the future generation just to start to talk with Georgian new generation, just to share and show your cases, your examples, and communicate with them as a partner, that before we return to the Ahiska, we have to return to the Georgia. I mean, to the Georgians, because we have to tell them story of the success communication of our ancestors. They used to live there for thousands of years, so it should not be forgotten. And I think we should build this trust and build a kind of foundation for future, I think, relocation and for those who wish to do.
Okay. You want to add?
Yeah, I was going, I'm totally in agreement with Dr. Kaiser. I was going to say there's a large Azerbaijani community that lives in Georgia. Azerbaijan and Georgia are on super friendly basis. To go between the two countries, you don't even need an ID. You just drive through. So using the community of Ahiska Turks that lives in Azerbaijan and leveraging that relationship, working it into Georgia, I think that would be the probably fastest, right? The quickest and the easiest way to start having some relationship with Georgia. But language issue, I feel like there is a huge amount of people in Georgia who also speak Turkish or Azeri, and a younger generation of Georgians, like many other countries in post-Soviet, right, became more nationalistic. They want to know their own language and not speak Russian, but also a large number does speak English. So I think at least for the beginning, the Turkish-Azeri connection, you can get by without really needing a Georgian, and maybe later on that can be an additional outreach.
Thank you. Do you want to add something?
Just want to add one point to this, which is I know the focus is Georgia, but it's very important that we also make outreach, that you make outreach to the Uzbek government, where there has been no discussion about the Fergana events of 1989 for the last 30 years. No acknowledgement, no recognition, and the 15,000 or less, you in this room probably would know better through relatives, how many people are in Uzbekistan. There's been no census for 30 years, actually showing demographically how large the community is, and I think that's important. And again, I think it's about scholarship and events like this, and maybe interface with the Uzbek embassy here in DC. There's a lot that can be done, but your average Uzbek on the street has no idea about this set of events, or the out-migration, or the fleeing of 90,000 people from the country. And it's an important part of your history. It's also a very important part of Uzbekistan's history. So I hope that, siz hama gapirasiz, Uzbekcha gapirasiz. A lot of you know Uzbek, so use that too. You have those skills, and I think that's a very important part of this discussion.
To give a small credit to new Uzbek government, they organized event this year and last year about bringing and raising this topic within our community and the community in Fergana. I was invited, but I wasn't able to go there, but there are other camps. So there is a positive changes, and the more important changes within the Uzbek community, we are very interlocked, and there's a number of Uzbek community members in US also working very closely. So I hope there is at least dialogue and communication, whereas in Georgia there's no zero, and there is a controversy involved, and threats. They don't understand each other. But Uzbek community, at least in community level, we don't have any issue, and the government is slowly taking the steps to kind of at least talk about what's happened there in '89, and of course, it was not Uzbek government, it was Soviet government. So we have to be very important to understand that it wasn't done under the leadership of Uzbek government. It was under Russian or Soviet occupied. Other panelists were using that, but it's Soviet, and it wasn't just in Uzbekistan. It was same thing in Azerbaijan and Eastern Europe. Many events happened. So that being said, you guys mentioned about Turkey and Azerbaijan and some other Turkic countries such as Uzbekistan. And my hope and dream, and I share that personally with His Excellency Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan of Turkey, personally, about opportunity and possibility of organizing event under and I share that with the Secretary General of Organization of Turkic States, to bring this topic as a one unified topic in Central Asia and Caucasus. It's one of the topics they have agreement, so they can engage in dialogue, not Turkey separate or Azerbaijan separate, as a block of countries, engage in dialogue and ways to find a solution within the Georgia, but also using their own leverage. There is a lot of interest for that group in the U.S. in the State Department. I hope under the Rubio it will continue. I'm not sure. We'll see, but that could be the leverage to actually bring to the table U.S. as well, using that body. So I give a huge significance to that organization, and I hope that they will be playing a key role to stability and peace in the region. And in order to find a solution, we must involve our elected officials in U.S. regardless. So that's been said, I want to conclude this panel, but is there any questions? Anybody want to ask any question? Go ahead.
Here, and if you don't mind giving
sorun, çocuklar, kızlar, oğlanlar.
If you don't mind standing up and giving
Yeah.
Sorry about that. My name is Niyaz Mamedov,
Yes,
and
yes.
I'm from Russia. I'm exactly in
You're one of new Americans. Yes.
Kabardino-Balkarian
From Bulgaria,
Republic.
yes. Yeah.
I'm in America like a couple years, maybe more, and then I was in
Impressive
Russian.
English.
Sorry for my English. My English is not
It's
great,
impressive.
but I can
No, don't
explain.
worry.
I will try it. And then I was in Moscow, Russian military, before war, before Ukraine. And then I'm in America. I'm in this country. And Trump is coming. He said, I will do something, but I'm not sure what he's talking about.
Okay, you're talking about the claim of deportation.
Yeah, I just want to know. I cannot to be there, and if I will be go there, I will be like, как будто, sorry about that, как будто он отправляет России оружие.
Okay, so deporting all the asylum seekers from Russia back to Russia is aiding them weaponize Russian army because they will send us to fight.
Yeah,
That's what
and
you're trying to say.
I want to know, can you told me, like American folks or somebody, American government here, and in my situation, мне нужно волноваться?
Okay, I understand. Let
Thanks.
me translate.
Thanks.
So it's a little bit out of context with we're talking, but it's worries of the new American that, like this young man came seeking asylum, if he has to worry about threat of being deported. And let me say to you, Mohammed and others already respond to these questions, and some others that we will fight and lawyers can say. Nazli, do you want to respond to this really quickly?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yes, I think you should be worried, okay? But I think the best is to be prepared for your case in immigration court. It's going to be harder for everyone.
Sorry, you got my case. Alicia, you're a lawyer.
Yeah.
When I come in America, when I was in Russia, I started like looking for a lawyer in America who will be защищать мои права.
Ага.
And in
Можете по-русски говорить.
в одном сайте я нашел ваше имя.
Да,
В одном
наш офис.
адвокатское бюро. И я начал изучать эту тему и решил связаться с вами, но уже в Америке.
Да.
Я связался с Алишером, с Халидей.
So it's actually a client of hers. So very good. But it's a details that maybe we should not discuss in public. We can talk to privately. But there is a way to help you.
Yeah, I want to know just решение, если вот именно в том случае, когда Трамп придет и
So let me make it clear. Trump is the president of the United States. United States has three powers. One of the power is the Trump and his administration. Another power is the Congress. And third power is judicial system. So it's a судебная система, judicial system. So one doesn't have any control. Trump has two controls right now. He has a legislative and executive. He has that control because unfortunately this president has enormous power over his party. So, but third one, the real power is the judicial and your case in the court. So
Unfortunately, Islam, it's not that. The immigration department is directly under Attorney General, directly under the president.
The
They
judges
are
too?
not Article 3 judges. They are employees of the Department of Justice.
So there is an issue.
Every single time we have a change in administration has a direct impact on immigration and the policy and enforcement. Sometimes laws don't even change and regulations don't change, but how our government enforces them
So
changes.
there is a lots of problems now. Она тебе ответит отдельно?
Я
Давай.
тебе, да, выйду, и я тебе отвечу.
Отдельно, хорошо. So any other question based on the Georgia panel? Go ahead. Kathy,
Hi.
please.
I'm sorry, I'll be brief. I just wanted to add a possibly optimistic note, and that is, I don't know the exact number of Russians who have found political asylum, however temporary, in Georgia. So it seems to me turning to some of them for assistance. I mean, I can't speak for them, obviously, even though I'm half Russian, but never mind. Might be useful and would be a good resource inside Georgia. Also, there are some Georgian human rights activists who you may already be in touch with them, but I would think they would also be helpful.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Okay, so like you said earlier, you said Russia taking over Georgia could be a problem, especially if some Ahiska Turks want to go back, right? So should we be more concerned about that or more optimistic about the Turks and Azerbaijan like talking with Georgia and like possibly forming an alliance with them?
Anybody respond?
So I think if Georgia completely falls under Russian rule, right, that it might be even more discouragement for Ahiska Turks to go back, okay? People left Krasnodar for a reason, right? And people who are still in Russia are coming through the southern border because there's no other way for them to immigrate here legally. So they're coming in asking for asylum because there's still a lot of persecution happening in Russia. So therefore, you know, we should be building our connections. But if Georgia changes drastically, then, as I said, I'm not sure it would be the place where people would want to return.
Maybe one point on Azerbaijan. I don't want to rain on the parade here regarding the potential of Azerbaijani support for this issue, but I have done some field work in Azerbaijan with Meskhetian Turks. The greatest scholar on Ahiska Turks in Azerbaijan, Arif Yunus. What happened to him? He was imprisoned, right, by the president when the crackdown on human rights in Azerbaijan started picking up. So I doubt, and in my various visits there, I've never seen Ahiska Turks or Meskhetian Turks recognized or engaged with in the way that you would expect, although there are some organizations.
So very small.
Yeah.
10,000 applicants. Government of Azerbaijan provide a huge grant in partner with Turkey, so people can visit every single village in Azerbaijan and fill their paperwork.
Yeah.
Then they translate every petition to a Georgian language because Georgia did not accept any other one. And it took 2.5 years. And every single meeting, Azerbaijan government meeting with Georgia, they are underlining the importance of, and I've been, so there is some issues, and there is a very active Vatan in there, very, very active. They are probably one of the most active organization is in Vatan, in Georgia, in Azerbaijan. And I'm not speaking about other political cracks that there's happening with the scholar you just mentioned, but to give a credit, I want to be fair. They done in Ahiska Turkish matter. They done and they doing a lot to convince Georgians that listen. And I've been a part of some of the conversation that there is a tons of Turks live already there and they are not causing any issue. So we'll see what's going to happen. But I want to get your perspective on the matter of Georgia turning to a point that they're waiting till everyone who actually deported died. That's what they're trying to do, they're dragging feet. So there is not many who actually been deported actually already left. So I want you get last word and then we're gonna conclude this event because we have to go somewhere else. Yes. Do you want to say a few words really quickly?
Sure. I mean, I think I am reluctant to assign that level of intention to Georgian decision makers. I think they're probably not thinking about this every day, saying, hey, this is our plan and this is how we're going to deal with the situation. We're going to just wait it out. I think that's highly unlikely. I think more likely is just there are other more pressing issues that are always kind of coming to the fore and drowning out this, long-standing serious issue, but one that has never kind of risen to be a top priority for them. So I think that's probably more likely than them having an intentional, way to sort of play the long game here. But I could be wrong, but that's my sense.
Well, let's see how we can continue to work together to try to achieve some of the steps to accomplish what we talk about here. And one of it may be organizing a larger event in DC next year with participation already people from State Department and embassies of Georgia and other respective countries. By the way, we did invite embassies, Josh, and unfortunately they didn't show up. So hopefully next year they will show up. And with that saying, I thank you everyone, and I'm gonna give to Josh. You have a question? No. Okay. And we have an event. I want to have, I can call it Senator Willis to give conclusive remarks right here, and then we're gonna travel to a very beautiful site called Diyanat Center with everyone. Thank you so much for participating, and thank you so much for enlightening us with the details and information and the possible solutions. Dr. Kaiser, I'm looking forward to meeting you in Dayton. I will invite you for this topic to educate our Ohio legislature, and maybe your effort can help us to bring more data and information about how to convince Ohio Council Commission on Genocide and Holocaust to include Ahiska Turks. So we will be definitely keep in touch with you. And again, huge thank to Josh, Jamestown, Pete, Steve, and Richard and all these young people who stood all the way. This room was full in the morning, and it's half now, but it's a huge accomplishment that all youth stay here. Okay.
And thank you, Islam. for all
Dr.
you've
Kaiser,
done.
how do we get your
this,
book?
This couldn't have been impossible without Islam.
How do we get your book?
It's on Amazon.
But without further ado,
So easy to find and it's not.
So I will try to be brief because I know you all have been here all day, but I want to just give a special thanks to the Jamestown Foundation. I want to thank the organizers of this event. I want to thank the panelists, and I want to thank each and every one of you for being here today. I want to just leave you with just a quick message of hope. You know, I know there's a lot of uncertainty in the future, but we survived our worst days. And that is exactly why we are here today. So there has been a lot of insight from the panels, from the people that we heard from. Let's take that, let's organize, let's energize, and let's mobilize and make sure we are making the changes that we want to see in our communities. Because as I look around, the change that we are looking for is in this room. I think I got to say that one more time. The change that we are looking for is in this room. And let's make some great things happen. Thank you.
Oğlanlar bunları yığıştırmaya yardım edin şimdi. Gidiyoruz Diyanat Merkezi'ne. 4:30'da çıkacağız Diyanat Merkezi'ne. Yukarıda lobide buluşalım.